Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is my wonderful Period 1 class. Say hi. Hi. All right, so this is our chapter on taxonomy, systematics, and phylogeny. And you started out with a bag of screws and nails and nuts. I'm curious, I asked you to sort them or organize them to come up with some sort of classification scheme. Once you did that, I asked you to take a picture of it, and then I asked you to go visit your sister investigative team, your neighbor team. Did you have the same classification scheme? No. Okay, but it was the same bag, right? I gave you the same bag, right? They were exactly the same. Yet you did not come up with the same classification scheme. Why is that?
Everyone has different opinions.
Different opinions? Okay, what were some of the things that you looked at when you looked at that bag? Yeah.
Screw top and screw bottom.
Screw top.
Like if it was rounded or flat.
Okay, rounded or flat top. Okay, what else were you things you looked at?
Size.
Size? Size mattered? Okay.
Like the bottom, if they were like flat.
If they were flat on the bottom or pointed on the bottom, was there any team that did not look at that? You didn't like, you know, let me tell you, the first time I did this, I didn't look at it either. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, no, I didn't have anybody else. I was doing it by myself on my dining room table. And the first time I'm like, why didn't I look at the bottom? Clearly there's pointy bottoms and flat bottoms, right? But I did look at the top. I heard you looked at the top, right? Curvy or whether it was flat on top. What else did you look at? Yeah. Whether it had the nut. Now, did anybody, because I saw a team that had a grouping where they had the nut on the screw and with other screws that didn't have a nut. Did anybody else do that? So did you place value on whether it had the nut on there or not?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, but some groups didn't. Okay, did you sort whether or not you could put a Phillips head on the top of it or not? Okay, did anybody put something with the nail? I saw a group put something with the nail, so you did, right? So amongst ourselves, amongst you AP students, we didn't really have agreement on that. And if we apply this to all of which I know you saw, we're going to revisit this at the end as well. If we apply this to all of life, how do you organize and classify all of life? I just gave you 9 things, okay? Now let's up that by a few million, okay? And then tell me, how would you classify that? What would you think is important? How would you assign them to a group? How would you name them? If you had to come up with a name for each of those, the screws, and some of them, they're meant to screw just into wood, some into sheet metal, so they serve different purposes. So how do you decide, how do you assign them based on what criteria? And then we don't know, how were those related? What was the first one to evolve? Did you think one of those was an ancestral species of nut and bolt and nail? If you were going to pick one of those to be the ancestral species, what would it be? Tell your bio buddy. Okay, let me hear back. What do you say? What is the ancestral species? You say nail? Does anybody else agree that the nail is the ancestral species? Yeah, a few other teams? Okay. So when we look at species, sometimes it's hard to decide. Things are different depending on if they're male or female. They look differently, or if they're asexual. These are all things we've talked about the species problem before. And maybe it's some rusted old nails, and maybe they look different because they're rusted or deteriorated in some way. Maybe they're missing the end of the nail, so you can't tell if it's got a pointed part to it or a flat bottom to it. And this would be, what am I referring to now if I'm looking at an old and rusted nail or screw? Fossils, right? Yeah, I'm looking at fossils that sometimes we only see a piece of it. So how do we know how to classify it once you came up with your classification scheme until it's completely organized? Now, I went to a smaller hardware store to go look. They literally had 2 rows of little tiny bins this big that everything was named, and you could pull that out. And I thought, what an analogy for life. And they only have maybe a few thousand varieties there. I know when I approached it, I immediately called for help because I thought I had a list of 9 things I was looking for, and I looked at that and I wanted to throw up a little bit in my mouth. I thought, I'll never find these. But that one girl, she could, like this, because she was familiar with her classification system and what was grouped in which area. But to come up with that, I'm thinking if you opened up this store and all of a sudden you had to come up with a scheme like that, that would be incredibly overwhelming. So we need to look at different types of issues with classification. Let's check in your notes, make sure I don't leave anything behind. Oh, no, I didn't. We're not there yet. So this is still part of your introduction here. We have talked a little bit about these 3 types of evolution already. So I would like youngest bio buddy, you start with this one, divergent evolution. Okay, and oldest bio buddy. Here was an example of divergent evolution where you exploited to a different area. We've already talked about this. What do you refer to these structures as? Homologous structures. Okay, so they have different purposes now, but they came from a common what? Ancestor. Good. Okay, oldest bio buddy, you talk about convergent evolution. Go ahead. So we've talked about this too. I mean, we looked at for swimming fins and what they're made out of, whether it's made out of bone that is arranged with a humerus, a radius and ulna like ours, like a mammal, or bones extending out to form like a fish fin. We looked at wings, right? We looked at bird wings versus honeybee wings. And what importance do we put on each of those structures? We need to watch out for that convergent evolution when we're classifying organisms. Okay, and then back to youngest bio buddy, you do parallel evolution. Okay, and then we looked at an example of parallel evolution with the placental and the marsupial mouse. They do not have a recent common ancestor, yet they kind of ended up looking very similar to each other. So when you talk about the different types, it goes to you. Why don't you use this little chart to help your neighbor out? Go ahead, use this. Why did I put the X's where I put them? All right, so I wanted to review those terms with you, just because when we talk about classification, we need to be aware of whether how that trait has come about. Whether we group organisms together, if it's a result of convergent evolution, and we need to look to see whether we need to dismiss that trait as one of the unifying characters that we look at. So this brings us, there are things missing. Oh no, we're okay. Take a look here. We're looking at a classification system. We're looking at a phylogenetic tree. Phylogeny is when you look at their evolutionary history. And so 2 words I want you to be familiar with. The first one is systematics, the study of the diversity of organisms using information from cellular to population levels. Okay, wait, cellular to population, what does that mean? What would I be looking at? Cellular. Okay, what could I look for in the cells? Their DNA.
Yeah.
What are the different types of cells? Prokaryotic and eukaryotic, so I could look at that, right? I could look at DNA. What else could I look at? I could look at organelles. What else could I look at in a cell? Yeah.
Like morphological differences, or that's not cellular?
I'm getting there, yeah. So I'm just right now I'm at cells. What else could I look at in a cell? What does DNA code for? Protein. So I could compare proteins, right? Then you start taking cells and you group those together. Remember atom, molecule, organelles, cells, tissues. I could start comparing, and then what? Organs, organ systems, organisms. Now I'm looking at morphological structures when I'm looking at tissues, organs, organ systems, right? I'm comparing those morphological structures. So organisms, then we go what? Population. Why would I look at a population? See how they interact. Now I'm looking at something else. What am I looking at? It starts with a B. I'm looking at behavioral traits. How do they respond to one another? Also, what else are they doing in their population? Reproducing. Do they reproduce or not? So the study of the diversity of organisms using information from cellular to population levels. It is used to determine phylogeny, and phylogeny is the evolutionary history of organisms. So you use systematics to determine the phylogeny. Okay, and a phylogenetic tree shows lines of descent and lineages. So looking at your notes, systematics, the study of biodiversity. You put the long, everything in there. And then systematic biology is the quantitative science. What does quantitative mean? Numbers. So does that mean I totally throw out value judgments? Do you have to make value? Did you make value judgments with your nails and your screws? So because some of you decided that's not important enough to separate it. This is important enough to separate it, yet we didn't all agree on that, right? That's why it's called a value judgment. Different people put different values on those characters that we are analyzing. So quantitative science that uses traits of living and fossil organisms to infer relationships among organisms over time, using traits to identify the evolutionary pathway of biodiversity. So then this brings us to taxonomy. So this is our classification scheme. So in this picture right here, it has kingdom all the way at the top, but we know there's a step above kingdom. What is that? Domain. So it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Which of those categories is the most inclusive? Domain. The most exclusive? Species. Okay? And I think a definition for you here. So taxonomy is the branch of biology concerned with identifying, naming, and classifying organisms. Is there a place in your notes for that, or did I already give it to you? So taxonomy is the branch of systematic biology that identifies, names, and organizes biodiversity into categories. It's organized systematics. Organized systematics. So we know up here above kingdom is domain. And so then you want to say, you want to have a way to remember this. I thought I gave you one, but maybe I did not. Did King Philip come over for good soup? Okay. Did King Philip come over for good soup? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And then we've struggled with the species definition, right? And if one species changes into another species, what do we call that? Macroevolution. And then you have to decide, is it another whole species, or could it be what would go below a species? Subspecies. Maybe it's a subspecies, okay, of that. For instance, we are Homo sapiens sapien. We're a subspecies of Homo sapien. All right, now, next, looking at a phylogenetic tree, could youngest bio buddy put this in their own words? What's going on in this phylogenetic tree? From your limited knowledge of plants, go ahead. All right, so when you look at this phylogenetic tree, what do you see happening in this tree? Diversification. Okay, what else? What do you think's happening? Why did moss go left and everybody else went right? Okay, everyone else is in a separate category, and you determined that because you said they have something that the moss doesn't have, right? And then when we get up to the second point, the second branching point right here, ferns went left and everybody else went right. So ferns don't have seeds. So everybody else from here up has seeds. So you kind of keep getting left off. It becomes more and more exclusive as you move to the top branches of your phylogenetic tree. The trunk is what everybody has. The trunk is what everybody else, but then as you move up through the tree, it becomes more and more exclusive. So we're, right here we go. Linnaeus used Latin, a two-part name. Both of these lilies share the same genus name, Lilium. Where they different is in their species name. But he had primarily what to go on. Did he have DNA and looking at rRNA sequences or mitochondrial DNA? Did Linnaeus have any of that? No, so he just used what? Morphology, just structures, in order to classify them. Okay, then. All right, so as Latin was lingua franca of the scientific world, it was logical for Linnaeus to give organisms Latin names to ensure stability and avoid linguistic fluctuation. In addition to his introduction of binomial names, the Linnaean system replaced a heavy string of names for various animals. For example, the honeybee, which had previously been called Apis pubescens thorace subgrecio abdomine fusco, Pedibus plasticus globus uternique marinique saladius, became Apis mellifera, a simple combination of the genus species name. Easier than to discuss. All right, so that was underneath. Go to classification. We're actually all the way down to Linnaean taxonomy, but I owe you a couple words. Linnaean taxonomy is a two-part Latin name. And then go back up to classification. A process of naming and assigning organisms or groups or taxons. Have to be careful of traits that are a result of what kind of evolution? Convergent evolution. Slate, you do 6A for today, and blue, you do 6B. And the word you want in 6B is place. Okay, go. All right, so the hierarchy, the nested hierarchical categories, and I gave them all here. These current categories are just the best hypothesis of evolutionary relationships. The highly suggested reading and thinking that you have is called DNA barcoding of life. And just like you would have a barcode on any object that's sold, that you could have a barcode as a result of every different species having a unique number of what? Adenine, thymine. What are those?
Base pairs.
Base pairs. Their base pair sequence would be unique to them. Okay, so you'll read about that in your highly suggested reading and thinking. All right, not it.
Not it, that's me.
Whoever is not it, pass and play. Tell them 2 things you either learned or reviewed. Go.
I didn't know much about that before.
Now, if you have
All right, so let's look at this phylogenetic tree right here. So we know it goes domain, then it goes what? Kingdom, phylum, class, order. So here we are, order, family, genus, species. So all of these organisms right here, they are in the same order. Then it gets broken down into 2 different families, and then genus, and then species. And I thought you might be interested, because there were reindeer up there. If you wanted to know more about reindeer, caribou have a large concave hooves that spread widely to support the animal in snow and soft tundra. So they're analyzing the way their hooves are. The feet also function as paddles when caribou can swim. And then there was something about, here we go. In Europe, caribou are called reindeer, but in Alaska and Canada, only the semi-domesticated form is called reindeer. So now you've got issues whether or not you're in Europe or in the United States. All caribou and reindeer throughout the world are considered to be the same species, but there are 7 subspecies, and then you can see the different subspecies that are here, depending on where they moved. And then Canada has 3 subspecies. And so anyway, I wanted just to kind of point out that even in this day, modern day and age, there's still going to be arguments about where you put each organism. Just like your nuts and bolts situation just kind of amplified, again, by a few million. And then here. Okay, yes?
Are different subspecies still able to reproduce?
Well, that would be the issue, right? So subspecies probably can reproduce with each other, but they don't for various reasons. Maybe geographical isolation, maybe there's a little bit of behavioral isolation, but if that's all you have, maybe you will have sex with them, or if they do come in contact with each other. Yes?
Dogs the same species?
Well, you have, well, I don't know if they're under, there are many different subspecies of dogs, but if you've ever had dogs and you know, will they mate with each other even if they're different species? Yeah, they will. So those hormones kind of override everything else. Could that ever cause problems in the offspring? Would they in nature have viable offspring? You have to look at all of that, because now all of a sudden we're taking into place artificial selection, right? Yeah. So when you're looking at a species, and that was a good segue and a good question, a species can interbreed and they share the same gene pool on some regular basis. So species can interbreed and share the same gene pool, but then you look at things like zebroids, the horse-zebra hybrid. Yeah. So did you ever know those existed?
That's so cool.
Don't forget the coolest animal of all, the liger. Okay, but zebroids are horse-zebra hybrids, so they can interbreed, but we would definitely call a horse and a zebra 2 different species, right? And then you have to look at any kind of issues is there selection against the hybrid for mating? A subspecies, you can see here some different subspecies. When we look at man's classification, and you kind of break our classification down, we are in the domain Eukarya. You already knew that, right? We're in the animal kingdom. Phylum Chordata, we have a notochord at one point during our notochord becomes our vertebral column to protect our spinal cord. We are subphylum Vertebrata, okay, within that phylum Chordata. Class Mammalia, order Primates, I always remember order like no monkey, and then family Hominidae, the family is home in the day, okay, then genus Homo, species Sapien. So this is our classification. So let's see, riddle me this, you are yourself.
Just saying. The level. Oh my gosh. Good.
Julia. Ja. Okay, I'm done waiting for you. Is it a hundy?
No, it's not a honey. It's you.
Wait, look number 4. I want to shoot you, but
Go, Tristan.
I was number 4.
All right. So your notes are in front of you, right? Okay, I'm just checking. So it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So the classification category below the level of family is what? Genus. Okay, so we struggled a little bit on that. Could you check your BioBuddies clicker right now and see if their notes are in front of them? All right, and then I'm going to put a pause right here. You want this broken up, yeah? Yeah. Okay. So be smart.